Hi, everyone. This is Unit 3 of Research Methods. Um, the PowerPoint presentation, just taking you through the slides and giving you a little bit different perspective on things. Your text, this unit, looks at planning a project and has some fantastic information about all the steps you should be thinking about, all the planning stages of planning a research project. It even talks about kind of some differences between an academic research project as opposed to potentially a more of a real world or practical. It's not necessarily that clear cut between the two, but anyways, I'm going to take a slightly different, I guess, perspective or slightly different tact on the information in this unit than your text. I think the text does a really good job of explaining things from that perspective. So I'm just going to give you a little different viewpoint on this idea of planning or preparing for your research project. Okay. Um, for today, for this unit, I'm going to start off with a little bit of in the news sort of information, talk about the 5 W's of research and 1H, go through the discussion questions, and then a little bit more information about some key points about the research problem, research questions, and how theory fits into this whole thing of conducting research. So, start off with taking a look at a few things in the news. And right now, to be honest, there are so many things going on in the news that sometimes it's difficult to just pick a few of them. Um, of course, we've got COVID, which is that kind of ever-present thing everywhere going on. We've got an election down in the US. We've got fires, flooding, storms, um, other elections going on around the world, other leaders being put into place. So, but one of the things I wanted to, I guess, bring your attention to this week, that, well, first off, the UNWTO, or the UN World Tourism Organization, is a fantastic source of secondary research. And so, kind of looking back at last unit, we were talking about sources, good sources of secondary information, and the UNWTO is a fantastic source, and you'll find it very useful in this class, in this program, and even beyond. I used to use the UNWTO information a lot, uh, somewhat when I was working with Parks Canada, but definitely on a very, very regular basis with the Canadian Tourism Commission or Destination Canada. And actually, when you work for some of these sort of organizations, they will often have subscriptions or membership with the different organizations, which gives you access to additional information that may not be available to the general public. So, anyways, they've just introduced this UNWTO recovery tracker. And it probably doesn't look much like much from this slide here, but check it out. Check out that link down there at the bottom, and you'll find it's got a ton of information all about some of what's going on in the different regions, visitation numbers, spend numbers, accommodations, all sorts of different things that you might need as far as information. You can click through and find it with the UNWTO, this recovery tracker. Not only that, but a really neat feature of it, especially if you're an information geek like I am, uh, it also lets you know where they're getting all of their data from, and you can source it right back to the actual information. So, for example, when they're talking about um, flights and the number of seats available and things like that going into different countries, it links you right back to IATA or the international, or I think, I'm not sure if they use IATA or ICAO, but basically one of the international airline um, organizations. So again, it's a great source of information for all sorts of different things, and it's also a great link to other fantastic sources of information. So definitely check it out. Like I said, this week, wanting to take a look at developing a research proposal and some of the key things you need to be thinking about. Like I said, your text does a terrific job of kind of walking you through several of the planning stages that you need to think about. Um, what I'm going to try to provide you with is some of the other things you need to be thinking about when you're putting together a research proposal. So some of the, I guess, call it the background information or the things that need to be going through your head as you're going through all of those different stages in a research project. First off, really thinking about what are called the 5 W's of conducting research. Of course, the who, what, why, where, and when of conducting research. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of these different aspects in just a second. But really, the idea here is that you need to get all of those elements very clear in your head. Um, Even better to write down all of these different aspects, but to go through all of those before you get into the how. You really want to leave that how part of the research until you've cleared up all of those other W's first. And the reason being is it's very simple to fall into I want to do a survey or I want to interview some people. And then you start developing your research project around the how, the method that you're planning on using. And that's the completely wrong way of conducting research. When you're doing research, after you've figured out all those W's, then at that point, then you can start thinking about, okay, now that I know exactly what I want to get, who I need to talk to, who are the experts, all of these sorts of things, then you worry about okay, now how am I going to get to that person? How am I going to get that information? What is the best method for gathering the data now that I know who I'm trying to talk to and why I'm doing this? Things like that. So again, um, leave how to the end. The other big problem sometimes with how and is that some researchers will get a new tool, um, a fancy new gadget. Maybe they see a new method of type of research, and they want to go out and try to use that new tool, that new technique, things like that, without thinking first of where it's most appropriate. So, wherever possible, leave the how to more towards the end of your planning process. First off, the who. Um, and big sigh. Uh, Remember when we used to be able to gather in a big group like that? Um, this is a big concert, so and it's probably going to be a little while before we can get into huge gatherings like this, but it will come. So you know, never fear. Who? The who isn't just who is the subject of your research. And actually, the next unit in the text, Unit 4, will deal a lot more deeply, a lot more specifically about the sample and the who of your research project. But it's really important with this part is when you think about the subject of the research, you really want to be thinking about who is the best person to give me that information. So for example, if you're trying to find out whether or not your customers are satisfied with your product or your service, it really doesn't do you a lot of good to talk to other people other than your customers. You might get a little bit of a sense, but the best people to tell you that sort of, I'm satisfied or I'm not satisfied and why are the customers. The same as if you're trying to talk to or trying to find out if your tour operators are getting all of the products or services that they require to be profitable. Talk to your tour operators. Don't talk to a third person about those tour operators, because then you're going to get their interpretation of what they think um, your actual customers or your actual subjects feel. Whenever possible, go straight to the source. A couple of other things that are really important when it comes to the who is who's the audience for the results, as in who's going to be reading the report. For example, nowadays, maybe you're doing a project on, the economic impact of an event, a music festival. And you have to think about, okay, maybe your first people who are going to take a look at the results are the organizers of that event. But other possible audiences for that information could be local community, the government, um, different sponsors. So, and all of these different people who might be audience, might be people that will listen to your or read the information. You need to be thinking about, okay, what will they be looking for? What sort of information do they need? Um, what is their level of understanding about this information? And all of these sorts of considerations will affect how you conduct your research and how you present your results. Who's initiating or driving the research? This can be very important, thinking about, okay, who's the person behind this research getting done? Now, this can be important not only for you if you're conducting research, but also this is really important when you're reading somebody else's research. Sometimes understanding who was the funder, who was the supporter behind the research can help you to better understand why that research was conducted, why the questions were asked the way that they were, all sorts of different things. And it may help you better understand whether you can trust the data, whether you can trust the results. Prime example, years ago when there was tons of research being done about cigarette smoking, and it was being funded by the tobacco companies, and surprise, surprise, um, they found that, smoking wasn't harmful to your health. Well, of course they found that. They were the ones that were bankrolling or paying for the research. So it wasn't any big surprise when they did not discover any negative impacts from smoking. So whenever you're seeing research results anywhere, find out who paid for it. And last thing on the who's responsible for managing or conducting the research? Also very important, if you're doing a research project or getting involved with an organization, find out who's got to actually do the managing or conducting of the research. their level of experience, things like that, why they're doing it. Some of the whats. What are the objectives for the research? What are you actually trying to accomplish with the research? And that can be very important to be clear on because you need to know, um, will that is that research being done to try to accomplish, try to change something? Um, what exactly is being researched? You need to be as specific as possible when you're taking a look at the research so that you are actually investigating the issue. What resources are available? And when we're talking about resources here, we're not only talking about money, but it's also time, it's personnel, everything like that. All of those things you need to be thinking about when you start putting your research project together. And finally, what differences will the results make? Um, when I was working with Parks Canada, the way that I operated was I was based out of, for a while, out of Calgary, Alberta, and then out of Vancouver, British Columbia. And my job was to, the different parks and historic sites, national parks and national historic sites, could contract me. They wouldn't have to actually pay me because Parks Canada was paying me, but they would pay all of my expenses to come do research for them. So I would be contacted by, for example, Banff National Park, and they would want me to do a visitor study on maybe a certain part of the park. And my first question was always, okay, when I bring you the results, what are you going to do with them? And sometimes it would get, the person bringing me in would kind of stop for a moment, but it really brought home the whole idea that if you're conducting research to try to just, you know, to confirm something, or you were planning on doing something anyways, um, maybe you don't need to do the research. If the research that you're gathering is not going to make any result, any difference, then maybe you really don't need to be conducting the research. Now, that that action based on the research could be we don't need to do anything right now, and that's fine. That's still a decision. That's still a choice. But if you're planning to do something, no matter what the research says, then rethink whether you need to do that research. Why? Why is this research needed? And why now? Um, why is this research needed? Sometimes there's a lack of understanding about a situation, so that's why you're conducting the research. That's fine. Um, quite often, there's something that is causing um, this research or kind of encouraging this research to be conducted right now. And it's really important to understand that part. Um, the sort of political background or understanding of why that research is being conducted. Why is this important? Because that can really highlight what information needs to be gathered. That can really highlight who the real intended audience of the information is. Um, that can also really highlight what sort of a political and social situation that you're getting yourself into. And it may show you that there's a lot more political sensitivities that will make your research either more difficult or less difficult than you initially expected. Um, This past summer, or last summer, not this summer, of course, but last summer, I did some research on music festivals in British Columbia. And one of the reasons why this research was being initiated at this time was because the industry was trying to go for more funding from the provincial government. And they were finding that some of the more organized industries, like the film industry, were doing fantastic when it came to lobbying the provincial government for more funding. But because the music industry, these music festivals did not have an organization, they did not have any data that told them how much of an economic impact they had on the local communities or the provincial budget. The politicians were less interested in giving them any money to do any promotion or organization or anything like that. So by me understanding why this research was being conducted right now, it helped me better understand and clarify what I was trying to accomplish with it and who some of the key audiences were. Where? Where will the research be conducted? Where should it be conducted? And where can it be conducted? Those aren't always the same place. Prime example, years ago, working with Parks Canada, and actually this is partly the case study for this unit. So I won't go too deep into that, but Lower Fort Garry, just outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, had contracted me or had asked me to come in to do some research for them on visitation. Trouble was, it was January, and there's not a whole lot of visitors at Lower Fort Garry in the middle of winter, if any of you that know Manitoba very well. So while the research should have been conducted on site, it should have been conducted at Lower Fort Garry. There's no way that we were going to do that in the middle of winter, and there's no way we could have gotten in touch with the people we needed to in the middle of winter. So we had to choose another location. We had to choose a surrogate location to conduct the research. So, and you may find that at times, for example, talking to one of the students about their proposed project, the student was saying that they wanted to take a look at a type of research, or a type of tourism, but that tourism is not done here in Victoria. So as much as they might want to, talk to people about that research or about that type of tourism here in Victoria, they can't. So, but instead, what I suggested doing was finding out whether or not people, or whether or not that type of tourism could work here, or finding out whether or not people from here would be interested in that type of tourism. So not exactly looking at this tourism that we don't have here, that's particular to this one location, but really thinking around about how other ways of doing it. The other thing to remember is that some locations will not allow you to do research without prior permission. For example, national parks, and national historic sites, you need to have permission before you're allowed to do research in those properties. If you can't get permission, you may have to find another location to do the research and try to do it in a similar fashion. When are you starting the research? When do you need to have that research done? And when is it practical or representative to conduct the research. So for example, people may want the data for, business planning purposes. And they're doing business planning purposes maybe over the winter, but the research you want to do, you would normally be taking over the winter. For example, maybe you're looking at winter travel, but people need that data before that winter travel in order to start making decisions. So that really means that you're going to have to change how you conduct your research and possibly some of the people you talk to based on when that research needs to be completed. The research that all of you are going to do for this class, you're going to be doing it in November. So you have to really be thinking about, okay, you're going to have all the research, your research done and your project handed in. I believe early December, but I'm not positive about that date. So you may have to adapt your research based on the reality of the timelines that you're given. So you can't always do your research when you want to necessarily do your research. So just something for you to think about. Again, after you've kind of gone through all of these sorts of questions, after you've thought through the who, what, why, where, when, then you can start dealing with the, okay, now how am I going to conduct this research? How am I going to put it all together? Your discussion questions for this unit. This kind of this first question here kind of takes you one step further than last week. Last week, we were talking about secondary sources of information, and I mentioned that social media can be sometimes, depending upon how you're using it and why you're using it, an okay source of secondary information. For this week, we're really talking about more as primary data. If you're wanting to try to understand, thinking about, okay, what sort of primary information, what sort of data might you be able to gather through social media? And thinking about it, is this sort of data, would it give you a good understanding of your audience? Why or why not? I'll let you think about that, and then, I'll weigh in on this question a little bit later on in the week. Next question. What concerns do you have regarding privacy and trying to conduct research? So in this question, really thinking about, okay, if you're trying to do research on what sorts of things do you have to think about when you're thinking about privacy and ethics and everything like that when you're trying to conduct research? When people, what impacts can privacy concerns have on conducting research? So if there is a concern by somebody about privacy, how might that impact your data? Can you rely on the information? If people are concerned about their privacy, can you rely on the information that they give you? And what can you do to reduce those concerns about privacy when you're conducting the research? On the flip side for this question, do you yourself have any concerns about privacy when you're a respondent? When somebody's asking you questions, whether it be in a questionnaire, survey, interview, whatever the case may be, do you ever think about privacy and the type of information that you're providing? And further, Have you ever given false information or not answered a questionnaire due to concerns over privacy? And why or why not? So just some things to think about for the discussion questions this week. So I wanted to kind of dive a little bit deeper into research problem and questions, sort of next steps when you're conducting research. And like I said, your text does a pretty good job of talking about some of these sorts of things. For example, in stage 3, redefining the problem. Stage 4, a statement of your aims and objectives, those sorts of things. But again, what I wanted to do is take a slightly different perspective or slightly different view. As a quick side note, this picture is from when I used to live and work in Queensland, Australia. This was one of the theme parks there, and that was my son, although this was back about probably 9 years ago. So he's changed a lot since that picture. Formulating the problem. Whatever problem you're trying to look at, it needs to be something that you can actually do research on. And when we're getting into something like, that's actually researchable, there's lots of things that can get in the way of you conducting research. For example, I've got some examples there. There could be political or social reasons why you can't look into something. Now, some of that might be due to where you are at the time. Sometimes some things are too politically sensitive for you to do research on. Sometimes you're not allowed to. It's not legal for you to be looking into certain things, or it's not safe, possibly, socially, politically, to be looking into certain things. Seasonality, of course, can make things difficult. You may also not have access to the people with the information. So, for example, maybe you would love to research why world leaders either are or are not taking climate change seriously. Wonderful topic, but at least at this point, it would be very difficult because you probably would not have access to many of them. So there's all of these sort of, barriers or things you need to be thinking about when you want to formulate a problem. Understand the limits and realize that not everything is possible. It's very simple, or it's very common, especially for new researchers, to want to solve all the world's problems. And so what can happen is you make your research project way too big. And it's something that we call scoping that I'll talk about in just a couple of moments or a couple of slides. But you really have to kind of understand what's possible and what's not possible within your resources, within the time that you have, within your own capabilities. You don't want to create so complex of a research problem that you're going to be, you will not be able to finish it, especially maybe in the time available or just in your own capabilities or levels of understanding. So really think through that part of it. Need for clarity. You really want to make sure that you've got that problem clarified because, and this may take a little bit of back and forth or iterations um, for you to get that problem fully clarified. But I'll give you an example that I read about regarding the development of a website. And this website was being developed, and they kept having problems. People were complaining about not being able to find certain things on the web page. So they added a search bar and thought, hey, great, we've solved the problem. People can't find something. We'll just throw up a search bar. That'll solve all the problems. Nope. People were still dissatisfied because they still couldn't find anything. They couldn't find what they were looking for. And it wasn't that they wanted a search bar, they just wanted to have things more clearly laid out on that home page so that they could just click and go to the items that they were looking for. So once the researchers had a better understanding of what the actual problem was, they redesigned the website, and use of the website and satisfaction with the website increased immensely. So make sure that you understand what the actual problem is before you start going too deep into it. Do your homework. Sometimes a little background research can help you better understand the problem. Sometimes a little background research can help you discover that somebody else has already done the research you're interested in, and you actually don't need to conduct the research. You just need to apply somebody else's research results. Again, going back to that idea of the importance of secondary data or secondary research. Network and rely on the experience of others. This is especially true when you're kind of new to the whole field of conducting research, where there's probably somebody else who has conducted research similar to what you're looking for. So ask around, rely on the experience of others. See whether or not somebody has conducted research similar to what you're interested in. Nowadays, it's so incredibly powerful with the internet that you can connect with people from all around the world and potentially, talk to the researchers who have actually conducted the research. Years ago, when I was first kind of getting into conducting research, uh, working with Parks Canada, I had found this incredible bit of research regarding interpretation and communications and signage. And at the top of the article, it had the email address of the author. So I sent a quick email off to this author and said, hey, I love your work. I'm planning to do some similar sort of stuff here in Canada. Just wondering if I could, get some insights into how you did, what you did, everything like that. And this person responded. She sent me additional articles, additional resources that weren't available elsewhere. And it was so incredibly helpful for the research that I was conducting. So, and then years later, I actually met her and I thanked her for that help that she had given me. But, you know, use the get to know the people around you who have conducted the research and have them help you wherever possible. Um, Document your journey. This is really important. And by documenting your journey, this is kind of keeping track of all the steps, all the different stages, all the different things you're doing, whether you implement them or not. Because what it can help you, as I put on there, it can save you time in the future because even if you don't implement it on this research project, maybe on the next one you will. Or the next time you're looking at a similar problem, you can look back at this and go, okay, why did I do what I did the last time I was faced with this problem? So the more of that sort of information you can keep track of, the more valuable it can be into the future. As I mentioned just a moment ago, research is very rarely a perfect, straightforward process. It's not that common, especially with the more complex research, or the more getting into research that's delving into more difficult issues or more recent issues, that you'll perfectly move from step to step, right from start to finish. Often you will have to, take a few steps forward, maybe a step back, a step sideways, all sorts of different things to, as you further understand, as you sort out your research and your research problem, as you discover new information, going through the process. And so don't get frustrated, don't get upset if you have to take a step back or change direction slightly. That's just the reality of conducting research. Once you've got that research clearly defined, then comes the research questions. And those research questions are not necessarily the actual questions you will ask in an interview. There's a difference between interview questions and research questions. Research questions are the things you need to know, the things you need to understand in order to achieve your research objectives. But each one of those research questions may have 2 or 3 different parts to them, and they are not necessarily, and quite often they're not, the same language or the same words you're going to use when you're actually conducting the research. So you have to go through these different stages. And just very quickly, three main types or purposes for conducting research. There's exploratory, when you don't really know or fully appreciate what your problem is, so you're just trying to look into it. There's descriptive, where you're trying to just talk about the certain situation, the conditions, getting an understanding at the moment, describing it. And then there's explanatory, where you go beyond describing the situation and you're trying to explain, or you're trying to show why that situation is. As it says there, you may even predict what's going to happen in the future if certain conditions are met. Once you've got some of these other things done, you're going to have to re-examine your research questions. Make sure that everything is clearly defined. Make sure that there's a clear link between your research questions and your research objectives or your research problem. Everything you're trying to look into needs to be clearly connected back to your research problem. If it's not, then maybe you don't need it. Maybe it's something that's not relevant. Very quick example of that. A lot of researchers, a lot of questionnaires that you see, they will ask about gender or income or things like that. And my first question to that is always, what difference is it going to make to your research for that answer to that question? So for example, if you find out that 60% of your population is female and 40% are male, are you going to do anything differently for that, for the female population to the male population? If not, then you probably don't need to ask about gender. Same with income. If you're not going to do anything different, if your operations are not going to change, if your decisions are the same regardless of income, then don't ask the question. It's not relevant. It doesn't make a difference. So, and last point there, decide what is in scope and what's out of scope. So if you are interested in finding out what people in Victoria feel about tourism, it's good to define what you mean by people in Victoria. Does that include people from Souk and Sydney and Colwood and Langford? If it does, then great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. But very clearly define who and what is in your research, is in the scope of the research that you're going to conduct. So these are just some of the key aspects or key components in a research: your purpose, what you're trying to achieve, and that lets you know when you've actually achieved the purpose or reached the end goal for your research. That's kind of your destination for your research. The research questions. What are the things you need to answer in order to reach or achieve that purpose? So again, linking all those research questions back to your purpose. Theory. Is there an underlying model or framework? Is there something there that you need to know? I found this on the web. Could you please repeat what you said? Is there something you need to know? Is there some sort of model or framework in order for you to... I found this on the web. Sorry. In order for you to achieve your... the theory is the kind of what's the basis behind some of the things that you're looking at, or the framework. Just to let you know what was going on there, every time I said theory, my Apple devices thought I was saying SIRI. So, more important components. Methods. The how. How are you actually going to conduct your research? Scope. Again, what is and is not a part of your research? Who is in and out of your research? What are the important things that are part of your research project? Strategy. Those are all the different steps you're going to be taking in order to achieve your research. And contingencies are what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if something goes wrong? What will you do? What if you can't get to those people from Victoria? What if you cannot do any face-to-face interviews? How are you going to handle that? What happens if, you're hit by a pandemic and all of the methods that you were planning to use are no longer possible because you're not allowed to have that personal contact. Kind of an extreme example, but that's just the reality of what we're going through right now. So, last that I wanted to talk about is how theory and why theory is important. Um, by the way, anybody who likes sort of investigations and these sorts of things, I really encourage you to read some Sherlock Holmes, because the whole idea of induction and deduction and things like that is really played out through a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Theories can really help you identify what are the key things you need to be looking at, what are the key things you need to understand, and they can also help not only on what are the key things you need to be looking at, but also how those different things interact with each other, what's important, how important they are, everything like that. So it shows you, kind of where everything is connected and where they overlap between, theories, practices, and the research. When we're talking about real world research, it's not always simple to just wait until that theory or that framework is developed or at least fully understood. Sometimes you need to go with half understanding or partial explanations, and you start move forward. It's always good, though, to, again, document everything, keep track, test out. Even doing minor tests on things can be very valuable to understand things. Years before I knew anything about marketing and officially doing research, I used to manage a store at a summer resort. And regularly, I would move things around in the store, putting them in different locations, and just keeping track of where were the best locations for certain things to sell. So back before I really had any, theoretical understanding um, of what point of sale products were and things like that, I understood that if I put some very inexpensive things by the counter, people might be inclined to grab one or two with their change as they were going out the door. Or if you displayed things in a certain fashion, you increase the likelihood of them purchasing them. Putting the more expensive options at eye level and the less expensive options either below or above your regular eye level to increase sales. So all these sorts of things I was trying out even before I understood what. You may hear the term conceptual framework, and a conceptual framework is how all of the different elements, your concepts, your different ideas come together, quite often in a diagram, to show how everything interacts, how everything connects together. Example, how people are getting uh, to school, and all of the different things that may affect the choices that somebody makes in order to get to school. There's their personal aspects, what's in them. There's things like their social, their, peer pressures and things like that. Whether their family can afford the different types of transportation. And environmental aspects, things like, how far are they away from school? So this diagram here is a way to show you how all these different elements come together and affect that central problem of how do kids get to school. So this would be an example of a conceptual model. And these can become much more complex, and you can see here. So to end things off on a bit lighter note, even if you are or are not inclined to read a bit of Sherlock Holmes, if you want to see research in action, watch a little bit of Mythbusters if you've never seen this show before. That YouTube example that I've got at the bottom, it's a very short video. It's actually not the whole episode. It's just kind of a clip of the episode, about 3 minutes long, I believe, about how people board planes and an experiment they did to see what's the fastest way to get people onto a plane. But Mythbusters, if you've never watched the show before, they do all of the things, all of the research elements, everything. They do experiments, they do control samples, everything like that. They do a really good job of conducting solid research in a very fun fashion. And not only that, but they blow things up. So that's fun too. All right. So check out Mythbusters if you want to see a bit of research in action. Anyway, that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for your attention. And as usual, you'll see a PDF of the slides for the unit as well. You've got the discussion questions. And to let you know, there will be a separate, very short video on the Lower Fort Garry case study. I decided to pull it off into a separate thing just to make it a little bit easier and a little more digestible. All right, have a good one, and that's it from here from a soggy Victoria. Take care.